This is what they saw just hours after terrorists destroyed the center of New York City. What they smelled, what they tasted. This is the fear they felt working in, around, and under debris that used to be the World Trade Center. In darkness and glass and jagged metal and water and sewage, and the unmistakable, inescapable presence of death in every direction. Volunteers stepping into the desolation of Ground Zero, Lieutenant John Frank and Captain Morgan, his rescue dog, both from Savannah's Southside Fire Department, walked into that great valley of death to help begin the recovery process. 2 Saturdays ago, WTOC News took John Frank, volunteer Captain Jason Barang, and K-9 Captain Morgan back to New York to recall that great moment of trial and try to understand the tragedy by listening to them and other people in New York who have the vantage point of history, the unique perspective of having watched America's darkest hour unfold.
And the rescue workers were going along and writing in the dust memories and words and stuff. And then in some of the streets, as they would find the gear, they would line up all the fire gear of the guys that they kept finding, of the companies that went down.
Look on this wall over here. Rest in peace, Frank Aguilino.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to read some of those walls. We went around one, it was really rough.
It is September 11th, 2002, a moment to return to Ground Zero. Carlton Fife's picture looks out from in front of the wrought iron fencing that surrounds St. Paul's Episcopal Church beside Ground Zero. It's one of hundreds of images that decorate the church in a makeshift memory wall that pays homage to the 2,807 people killed in Gotham on September 11th. A happy birthday wish is there for Jimmy Quinn, who smiles at passers-by from the corner of Broadway and Fulton Streets. And Lucy Crevassi's picture, sitting above teddy bears and bouquets of flowers, proclaims her 51 years young. Lee Fahling's memory is captured in his fireman's uniform. From the dates beneath the image, you can figure out that he would have turned 30 on October the 1st, had he been out of town on September 11th, or unable to make it to work through a typically terrible New York traffic jam. But no such immaculate moment rescued Lee Fahling, or Lucy Crevassi, or Jimmy Quinn. Their fate is what all the lucky ones avoided. The church itself is regarded as a miracle by many in the city. Situated directly behind where the Twin Towers once stood, tourists look up and they ask how. How could the extraordinary damage of 9/11 have left one little spot of green completely untouched?
See, the hand of God protected this.
The hand of God protected this, says Savannah firefighter John Frank, standing beside the fence. On the night of September 11th, John and Morgan, his K-9 rescue dog, loaded up their unit, drove nonstop to New York. It's a 10-hour trip. John did it in 8. To join the rescue efforts that had already claimed the lives of hundreds of New York City firefighters, police officers, and EMTs. What he saw was carnage more suited to Armageddon than the financial center of the world.
We called it a war zone, and Doug called it hell. It was the closest thing he could think of to the death and sorrow.
Yeah.
Doug is Doug Sahlberg, who was there beside John and Morgan with his dog, Molly. The 2 Savannah teams went to New York to sift through the rubble and gather the remains of the nearly 3,000 dead. Horrible, morbid, thankless. It was work that had to be done in the dripping despair of Ground Zero.
On day 4, they changed our orders. We knew it was a recovery, but couldn't tell the firemen that because of their morale. And because we knew after the first 6 hours, there was going to be no living people in this. Because a New York City fireman was watching me, we weren't supposed to tell them what we were doing at the time. They know now, but at the time they wanted rescue, not recovery.
On day 4, John and Morgan, Doug and Molly walked the perimeter of Ground Zero. They weren't supposed to, because there on those streets were the scraps of paper with the everyday notes and the doodles that turned parts back into people, bodies into brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, moms and dads.
And walking around, we started walking through 3 or 4 blocks from here, paper that's that thick. And we're looking at it going, this was on somebody's office, just moments, before it crashed. And you could see their names and where they had made handwritten notes of things to do that day. And
Well, all that we saw, you still had that impression that total destruction was close at hand, that it was nearby. But I mean, we are a good distance away with buildings between us and the site, and you're talking about things being destroyed right here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at St. Paul's Church, almost a year later, the notes have faces and personalities like Carlton Fife, whose sweet epitaph is a final shared smile, a last inside joke from his wife Haven, who wrote, "To a ridiculously tall and insanely handsome guy, loving father to Jackson, 22 months, and his unborn child due May 11th. American Airlines, Flight 11.
A year ago today, at this time of day, that was a very different skyline, a different New York, a different America. But in just a few minutes, an airplane will hit one of the towers of the World Trade Center. People will think, well, this is just a terrible mistake by air traffic control. But in a few minutes more, another plane will hit the other tower. And all America will know this was no mistake. New York City firefighters, police, EMTs will rush to the scene. And in just a few hours, both towers will tumble to the ground, burying many of them under tons of concrete and steel. In Savannah, Georgia, John Frank, Doug Sahlberg, and Morgan will get into their car and they will begin the long drive, non-stop, to add their sweat to the grim task of separating the living from the dead.
It was difficult to ascertain how bad this was going to be. I mean, you had the Twin Towers hit, you had the Pentagon hit, there are other planes that are in the air. My God, how far is this going to go?
CBS News headquarters in New York is a matter of minutes from the site of the World Trade Center. The news of the disaster and its scope were not in a faraway land where a correspondent should be dispatched, but in their own backyard and where their friends and families lived and worked and died.
We have a colleague here at CBS News, 23 years old. Her father was killed. He was in the second tower.
They all thought they were going to die. I mean, that kind of, when we look at it on TV, we can't even really get the feel for what it must have been like.
You go over by there, you can see the people jumping out the window. They're jumping out the window right now. Oh, my God.
Correspondent Byron Pitts was nearly consumed by the wave of debris that swallowed New York streets.
And we were close, trying to do our job. And when the building first began to fall, we thought, okay, well, it's falling the other way. And then we began to see a fireball roll towards us. And people were running. And then we realized it was dangerous to be where we were. We ran as hard as we could. And there were thousands of people trying to find their husbands, their wives, their daughters.
I don't even know if there's a point of this, showing this, but, we love him. I'm looking for my sister-in-law. Her name is Clarence Schwartz, and she was on the 100th floor of Tower 2. And here is her picture.
Intelligent, reasonable people would show up with their, their wife's picture, their husband's picture, and say, "Please, if you've seen this person," and that went on for days. So to see love like that and to see how brave people were, that's what I remember most.
Midday reports from WTOC sources identified the president's helicopter, Marine One, hovering over Beaufort, South Carolina. With the scope of the attack on America unclear, the president's whereabouts a dark secret, well, the confidence of the American people began to shake. John Roberts, CBS correspondent, was in the midst of the pandemonium in Washington, D.C.
I walked in the gates of the White House just as the plume of smoke rose over the Pentagon, and people started running around frantically at the White House. The Secret Service emergency response guys were telling everybody to get off the grounds of the White House. They said they thought it was okay to stay inside the building, and then about 30 seconds later they rescinded that order and said everybody's got to get away from here right now, because they knew about that other plane, Flight 93, that was still up in the air. Was it headed toward the Capitol building? Was it headed toward the White House? Nobody knew at that time. So, I mean, it was quite shocking. It was just such an assault to the senses. It was just one of those things that just hits you in the face so hard, because you've seen disaster, death, and destruction all around the world. But when it comes home, it's something quite different.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
As the president was secreted to a secure location back in New York, the unimaginable.
He was asking, did the building collapse? We were trying to figure out, what happened. He was on the phone with one of our reporters who said, yes, I can confirm. It came down, Dan. It came down.
Just kind of froze. And then we saw the second plane hit, and then the buildings collapse. And it was just like a state of shock. And like people have said here, New York was quiet that day. I walked home that night. Stayed here, didn't go home, didn't, called my family to make sure everybody was okay. The scariest part was talking to my father, who lives overseas, and we're frantically trying to reach each other because he had heard it there. And when I finally reached him, he just pulled over in his car and just started crying.
At day's end, the skies everywhere over America were quiet as New Yorkers walked across the bridge home. And around the world, a question formed that hadn't been asked of Americans in the entire 20th century. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner still wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave?
The quiet destruction of One World Trade Center was deceptive. It seemed total, complete, but the danger was not over, not nearly.
The fire was so hot when we got here from Tower 7 burning, and everything still coming, from the piles and everything else, and the aviation fuel that had originally fell and everything, that those huge steel beams, you could hear them, they were like rubber bands. The fire was so hot, you'd see the beam, it looked like it was burning. All of a sudden you'd hear dong, and it would bend. The beams were just right around on the ends. They dumped tons. I mean, they had ladder trucks and hoses set up, and especially in this area here, they had all kinds of stuff dumping water. They had to be careful though, because when they started dumping it towards some of the piles, we would be under those piles, and it would produce a cloud of steam that just threatened to scald you. I have pictures of Suburbans that were, and cars that were rolled on top of each other and burning. The blast so powerful, it blew cars all in piles all through here. Even blocked that one block, there were vehicles burning when we got here the next morning. There were still fires in the road. They hadn't contained all the fires.
God forsaken. That much was clear on the streets of New York as September the 12th dawned. John and Morgan went to work even as the work came to them.
The scent of death was going down so many blocks. Geez, you could smell it in the sewer system a mile and a half away.
No one knew, no one could know what was next, how the destruction might domino and collapse other buildings, creating still more martyrs of rescuers like John and Morgan.
The World Finance Center sits directly across the street from the World Trade Center, and it took a substantial hit, quite a bit of damage. And that's where we went through for the first 3 days to get to ground zero, as it was filling up with sewage and water. In some places you'd carry the dog, and it was very dangerous to go through because all you had, it was dark and you'd fill through. And it was very dangerous. And you had to come out the windows on the other side. And good golly, look at the walls. All the windows are back.
Back on New York streets 2 weekends ago, John and Morgan were amazed at the progress the city had made in just a year. Standing just across the street from the site of his darkest moment at Ground Zero, John recalls the day he thought he'd lost Morgan.
It would be about where that yellow, just on the other side of that yellow vehicle, that yellow-white vehicle sitting there.
Yeah, about where the flag is.
And we had to climb through the windows there to get, we were working down here on the other side. There used to be an archway here that collapsed, and we were working on the other side. That's where the main collapsed when the vehicles were flattened. We climbed through, and they asked us to go back to the pile, and one of the that's where the North Towers sit. And when we worked our way trying to get up that pile was when we fell. I don't know if it was the shaking that was going on because the alarms were ringing. I remember after I fell, and I heard stuff falling, and, you know, it was glass. It was a daily thing, us running out because of stuff trying to fall, and they were worried about the buildings falling. And but when we fell, I hit. That's where I broke my arm. And she was hanging off the edge, and she was on the 14-foot tether, and she was pulling me off. And I knew that could be 100 feet or greater because some of those areas went down 7 stories below ground level. So I had to let her go. And I let her go, and she fell 2 stories. And but 8 firemen and a police officer at the top had witnessed it and ran over. And I just told them to go because we figured we weren't coming home from this. And I figured that was it because you could hear stuff crashing if something was falling. You knew that you could hear the people blowing air horns, and, you know, and they're yelling to get out. And I just said, just leave us. And they wouldn't leave. They worked their way down to me, and then we worked our way down to the dog. And then I carried that dog out because I didn't want her waking up somebody else's arm injured because she'd tear him up. And we worked our way back up the pile, and with their help, I worked my way back to the side of this building through the window. But it was pitch black in there and filled with water and sewage, and I lost most of my escorts coming out. When we ran out the side door here, that's when we saw the command post was gone. They were running, and we knew something major was occurring. They were worried, and we didn't. I figured I wasn't gonna make it at that point because I couldn't go any farther. And I ran with her, and I remember that wall, the second wall. And I made it down through the next intersection. I couldn't make it any farther. And my arm was killing me. My right arm was broke, and my arm was killing me. And I just couldn't go any farther. And when I went to my knees, where there were 2 iron workers, because everybody was running, everybody was leaving. 2 iron workers come and took her the rest of the way, because the FEMA Vet Center from here was about a mile away. And that's when they said that they were going to put her to sleep. That was a bad day.
John's emotional reaction on his return to Ground Zero is understandable. He's seen many of the well-manicured settings before, only in a much darker, more sinister circumstances. To look back through his eyes is to see something that he and Morgan actually lived.
And they said, well, we'll watch her for a couple hours, see how she does. And she woke up after 2 hours. And at 4 hours, I didn't have the mentality to take a picture. At 4 hours, they took a picture of her. It's on their website. And of her awake, wanting out of the cage after she was patched up with an IV still hanging out of her.
They stitched her up, or
they just bandaged it shut. And at 6 hours, we went back to work. At 6 hours, we were back on this pile. Myself with the temporary cast and her with temporary bandaging. And we're back out here working, and we finished an 18-hour shift.
Back they went, John and Morgan. Back to the piles and the dark and the stench, propelled by the same force that brought them there in the first place. The same force that led New York firefighters into the crumbling mountain that was the World Trade Center.
Why? Duty? Had to.
Even today, the reminders of the tragedy are everywhere in New York, though many are invisible to all but a chosen few. Who would have thought that the plague of spray-painted graffiti would be more than the handiwork of Big Apple hooligans?
An X. An X means it was checked. The building was checked to be sure that no one was in the building. They had completed the search.
What's all this other stuff, do you know?
That I don't. That's the date they completed the search, the time they completed the search, the primary hazards, and then no people were found. And this probably is the unit that was responsible for it. It's California Task Force 7. But you use an X, it tells you that the search is complete in the building. And that would tell us we didn't have to go back in.
15 firemen from Ladder 4, Battalion 9, Engine Company 54, died on September 11th. 15 men who had something, some quality, that led them into a building from which terrified men and women were jumping to their deaths.
You know, we protect a very busy area here. So the toughest thing was being left behind and having to protect here when we couldn't go down there.
Yeah.
And it was a real tough thing to do because we all wanted to be down there. Some people had to stay back here and do the bit here.
The Hudson River offered safety to many of the fortunate not trapped inside the buildings or swept up in their collapse. From this park, the lucky ones took a ferry to New Jersey and safety.
The alarm went off, and we're running. We have to get off the pile first. They say the building's coming down. We're all running. If you've never seen 5,000 or more people run, it's a scary thing anyway, stampede. And we're trying to run. Doug got blocked by a tractor trailer that had parked angled, and he figured that was it. He stopped running because, you know, we figured we weren't coming home. And I was running, and a fireman fell, and I stopped to help him. I wanted to leave him. They didn't leave me. It was that way every day.
I see the smoke come down and the people running. I say to the woman, Mary, better get out of here. Get out of here. I go by Chambers Street. I look back. I see the American airplane come. Boom!
Jose Pereira has been in New York for 58 years. He was in New York on September 11th. He says that since the tragedy, the Big Apple has dried up. Gone are the high rollers, replaced by backpacking, fast food eating youngsters who sleep in Central Park.
See, look at the city, the empty, look. Nobody on the street, look. Look like Sunday morning.
CBS financial analyst Alexis Christoforous has the numbers to back up Jose's street analysis.
And now, really, the lower Manhattan area needs to talk about its future because a lot of the Wall Street firms left. About 100,000 jobs left the downtown area. And now the big challenge is how do we rebuild lower Manhattan and continue to have it be the nerve center of the financial district, really not only for the city and the country, but for the world.
Access to Wall Street and the New York Stock Exchange are tightly monitored. Security carefully maintained. The remaining centers of the American financial system are mindful that capitalism itself was the terrorist's target. The hole in the middle of New York is mirrored in the minds of many on the street.
I mean, I went in and out of that building every day, twice a day. So now you see I think you see a lot of emptiness.
There's not much to see at Ground Zero now. Though tens of thousands come, the gleaming symbols of American prosperity are gone. Gone, too, is the rubble that marked the thousands of graves. What remains is a shrine where the awful consequences of the terror and the extraordinary courage of its victims can be imagined in a single space. Richard and Lisa Braun from Hinesville are among the crowd on this day. They'd seen the World Trade Center before. Now, it seems unbelievable that it could be gone.
Buildings compared to what was there before.
When you're in southeast Georgia, this seems such a world away. And almost a year ago now, when we came back here, chill bumps erupted on my skin a year later. Absolutely soul-stirring. That's the only way I know to describe it.
The streets of New York are hospitable to John Frank and Morgan. The stories of courageous rescue teams have reached many ears, and people are anxious to say thanks. Shake a hand, take a picture. The closeness of the city in crisis reminds John of the 8 days after September 11th, when he was at the mercy of the city that never sleeps.
New Yorkers, they opened up their arms to us. There were days where we didn't, have nothing to eat or drink on the pile, or very little. And a lot of times they'd be right outside every day. They were right outside the gates with stuff that they'd buy and bring themselves just to give us something. Even the hot dog sales guys, the little hot dog carts on Times Square, because a lot of times we get off shift. It'd be well after midnight, it'd be 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And we just go through Times Square to pick up a hot dog, just so we had something to eat before we went to the hotel, lay down for a few hours. And those guys wouldn't take any money from you. They just wanted to help in every way they could.
New York has changed, not just the skyline, but the people who have earned a new understanding of life born of their new sense of tragedy and compassion and courage.
So for about, 20 minutes on September 11th, we saw our humanity at its worst. But I think in the weeks and months to follow, we've seen human beings at their best.
The financial backbone of this country is so strong and so resilient that we did bounce back, that 4 days after those Twin Towers came down in the heart of the financial district, the opening bell rang at the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ stock market reopened, and people re-entered the market.
You see stories for the whole year. We've been seeing stories of people that lost their loved ones, people that survived the tragedy down there themselves. And you just think the human spirit is so unbelievable.
For me, the defining image of America standing tall was when the 3 firefighters hoisted the American flag on that flagpole that was left in the rubble. I mean, that really said that from the ashes we will rise, and that we can't be beaten back. Our spirit can't be beaten back. You can kill our people, but you can't kill the spirit of democracy in the United States of America.
The wound has not healed. But clearly, the notion the terrorists had of bringing down America, well, that's been buried under a pile of rubble far heavier than that of the World Trade Center. Shoulder to shoulder, Americans stood together to reaffirm 2 hallmarks of the American spirit. America will endure. But we will never forget.